Mostly I see people from the Baha'i World Center, but although some of our center as well are present here. Today we have the honor of hosting Dr. Michael Karlberg, who is a professor of communication studies at the Western Washington University. His overarching program of research focuses on the social and ecological implications of the Western liberal culture of conflict and competition. He is the author of Beyond the Culture of Contest, From Adversarialism to Mutualism in the Age of Interdependence, as well as numerous journals articles on related themes. One of these themes is the way the Baha'i community approaches transformative social change in the face of oppression. And in the previous, the last lecture by Dr. Momen, he referred to this aspect as well. The community's entirely non-adversarial approach, which he refers to as a constructive resilience, has profound implications for the theory and practice of social change in the 21st century. This is the second time that Professor Karlberg is honoring us with his presence and willingness to broaden our knowledge of other aspects of the Baha'i faith. And today's topic of the lecture is Constructive Resilience, the Baha'i Response to Oppression. And please, the floor is yours, and thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to keep this a little informal and try and leave time that we can actually have a conversation, question and answer, comments, these sorts of things. So I'm going to talk specifically about the Baha'i response to oppression in Iran. I want to just preface it with a few notes, just so nobody has any sort of misunderstanding of some things that I will be saying. But first, I just want to say this presentation is looking at the situation of oppression in Iran that Baha'is experience, but this is not intended to be a critique of Iranian civilization or culture or Islam. Many fine things I could say about all of those things. This really is embedded in the context of, I think, what many people recognize, a fairly toxic mixture of politics and religion in Iran at the moment, which many, if not most Iranians today, I think, are realizing its oppressive nature. The Baha'is, of course, have experienced fairly systematic oppression in that context, not only since '79, but for many years on and off, sort of waves of persecution. So that's the sort of broader context. Also, most of what I'm going to say is actually been published in an article by this same name, Constructive Resilience, the Baha'i Response to Oppression in Iran. I brought a copy of it in case anyone wants to look at that in more details. I'm not going to get into all the fine print of that, but I guess the article goes into quite a bit more depth, sort of substantiating and documenting the claims I'm going to make today. So let me quickly provide just a sort of overview of the situation of the Baha'is in Iran. Most of you are very familiar with this, I know, but just to contextualize their response. The Baha'is have really experienced reoccurring waves of persecution for over 150 years in Iran. And in that time, somewhere between 10 and 20,000 Baha'is have been killed, often in very brutal ways. Since 1979, in the Islamic Revolution, a new wave of persecution was unleashed. Hundreds of Baha'is were rounded up and executed in the early days of the revolution, fairly quickly. Since then, thousands have been detained, tortured, imprisoned. Tens of thousands have lost their jobs, their savings, their homes, their property. Baha'is have been declared unprotected infidels according to Iranian law, which means that crimes can be committed against them with impunity. All Baha'is have been systematically vilified through the media and from the pulpit. The names and locations of many Baha'is are recorded by the police. The authorities routinely search their homes, often arriving in the middle of the night. Baha'i grave sites are being systematically desecrated. Baha'i children are the targets of state-sponsored intimidation in schools. And Baha'i youth have been denied access to higher education as part of a systematic strategy of the government or policy of the government to block the social and economic progress of the Baha'i community. So this is actually just a very simplified version of what Baha'is actually are experiencing. There are many more details we could go into. But to justify this persecution, the Iranian regime has manufactured a range of baseless charges against the Baha'is, such as spies for Zionism, or spies for Russia, or the British Empire, or America, or you name it, all sorts of other, often mutually contradictory accusations. Every neutral observer who's investigated these claims, from the United Nations to Amnesty International to scholars of various stripes, recognize that the Baha'is are persecuted solely for their religious beliefs. I'm sure many, if not all of you, know that really the fundamental beliefs that they hold are that humanity is entering an age of global interdependence. And our primary challenge at this moment in history is recognizing the oneness of humanity and translating that principle into a new social order. Baha'is also believe in the harmony of science and religion, the equality of men and women, obedience to the laws of the land they live in. Baha'is don't proselytize their beliefs or impose them on others. They organize their internal affairs without any clergy in a unique system that you might call democratic governance, although it certainly varies from the partisan democracy we see in the world around us. Baha'is believe that education is a key to human progress. Baha'is started many of the first modern schools, including the first schools for girls in Iran, which Soley has documented very well in some of his own research and publishing. So, for these beliefs, among others, the Baha'is have been persecuted in Iran. And if anyone has doubt about the fact that it's their religious beliefs that is the source of persecution, I think the ultimate evidence lies in the fact that when Baha'is are imprisoned and interrogated, they're usually asked to recant their faith and offered freedom in exchange. So this seems to be pretty clear evidence of what the foundational concerns are of the Iranian regime. So, Iran Human Rights Documentation Center has described the situation of Baha'is in Iran and the persecution they faced as reminiscent of the methods of the Spanish Inquisition. The motives ultimately behind this are pretty clear. The religious elite in Iran feel threatened by the mere existence of the Baha'is because the interpretation of Islam that's propagated by the ruling clergy today cannot admit the possibility of coexistence with a post-Islamic religion, especially one that is deeply attractive to many Iranians because of its progressive teachings. And for this reason, they feel it undermines or threatens their grip on the Iranian psyche, their privileged social and economic position, and the extensive system of financial endowments that supports it. This is ultimately why the Baha'is have suffered recurrent waves of violent persecution for 150 years. Now, what I focus on in my own scholarship is actually not the persecution, but the Baha'i response to it, which I think is not only of interest for those trying to understand the Baha'is, but actually I believe it's of deeper interest for those trying to understand strategies of social change and sort of theories of social change, of which there's a rich literature, much of it tracing to Gandhian nonviolence and the exploration of alternative to violence. So this piece was published in a journal called Peace and Change, really in dialogue with that literature. So what's unique about the Baha'i response to oppression and their approach to social change is that not only is it non-violent, which it shares in common with like Gandhian approaches, but it's actually entirely non-adversarial or non-oppositional, which is not the case with Gandhian strategies of social change. Strategies of civil disobedience and a lot of the methods of Gandhi are in fact confrontational, but in non-violent ways. Now, that's not a critique of those strategies. This is just to differentiate what we're talking about here. So, in a context of, a lot of experience with nonviolent strategies in the 20th century, Baha'is have been pursuing a different path. And we believe that ultimately other strategies are not only possible, but are imperative because of the conditions of sort of heightened interdependence that we find ourselves in on this planet. So in my scholarship, I refer to this as constructive resilience, this sort of model or approach or strategy that the Baha'is adopt. Within this approach, broadly speaking, all of the community's efforts, all of the community's energies are focused on unifying and constructive work, oriented towards the advancement of the entire community, not merely the Baha'i community, but the societies in which they live, such as the establishment of schools in Iran, which were open to people from all backgrounds and were actually sought out by people from many backgrounds. Now, as Baha'is are engaging in constructive work of various kinds, if they become targets of persecution while pursuing that work, then they adopt a strategy of resilience. In other words, they continue their constructive efforts to the best of their abilities in the most resilient and resourceful ways they can, meeting persecution with patience, appealing for justice through whatever legal channels are available, and inviting the world to observe the injustices that are being committed against them. And of course, this latter element of the Baha'i approach is one that in some ways has only become possible in recent decades. So in all these ways, the Baha'is really, and consciously and purposefully, have never let their oppressors establish the terms of the encounter. They've refused to play the role of victim, refused to be dehumanized, refused to internalize or return the hatred that has been directed against them, refused to compromise their principles, and refused to forfeit their sense of constructive agency. One of the clearest examples of this in Iran, and there are many things we could look at, but the example that brings this into focus very clearly for outside observers is the way the Baha'i community has responded to the denial of access to higher education. So, for those of you who don't know, in the early 1980s, Baha'i university professors across Iran were fired, Baha'i students dismissed from university, expelled from the universities as students, and with very few exceptions since then have been unable to pursue higher education in Iran. Rather than taking to the streets in protest or organizing some form of oppositional movement or civil disobedience of various kinds, what the Baha'is did was simply begin to construct a university of their own inside Iran in a decentralized manner. This university is called the Baha'i Institute for Higher Education, sometimes referred to as BIHE. It was founded by the Baha'is of Iran in 1987. The purpose of the university is to provide for the educational needs of Baha'i youth and adults inside Iran. It operates via online courses, supplemented by seminars and labs in Baha'i homes and offices throughout Iran in a dispersed and decentralized way. Now, despite efforts by the Iranian authorities to disrupt and shut down this university by raiding hundreds of Baha'i homes and offices associated with it, confiscating BIHE materials and property, arresting and imprisoning many faculty and students, despite that, the university has grown since 1987 to the point that now offers over 1,000 distinct courses with 4 associate degree programs, 18 baccalaureate degree programs, and 15 graduate degree programs, ranging across the arts and sciences. These programs are supported by approximately 700 voluntary faculty and staff from both inside and outside Iran, including some who are not Baha'i, including some who are Muslim inside Iran who risk imprisonment to provide this service. The reputation of this university for academic excellence has led more than 70 respected universities in North America, Europe, Australia, and elsewhere to accept BIHE graduates directly into their programs of graduate study at the master's and doctoral levels. So this was the Baha'i response to that particular form of persecution. One could look at and catalog other creative acts of resilience the Baha'i community in Iran has come up with, but this is such a tangible and easily conveyed illustration that I'm sharing. Now, on a side note, and just to maybe humanize this a little bit, I've been teaching an online course through BIHE for the last 4 years. I was invited to help develop a core course and teach it to some instructors. Every semester I've taught this course, I've had students who have either been arrested mid-semester and imprisoned, who were released from prison just prior to taking my course, or who currently have family members or friends in prison. This picture, I don't know if you can see if it's in focus, yeah. On the far right of this picture is one of my students. The first year I taught the course, I won't say her name for her protection, because I believe we might be being recorded right now. But midway through the semester, after wonderful performance in the course, she sent me a very respectful and apologetic email informing me how sorry she was she wouldn't be able to finish the course, despite how much she feels she's learned, because she has to report to prison on Sunday. Shortly after that, another student in the course sent me this picture, which is my student and 4 of her friends who were all arrested together for volunteering in their neighborhood to help young adolescents. They were arrested, and this is the morning they gathered to walk to prison together to report for their prison term. And I include this picture because I think more than the sort of, theoretical aspects of constructive resilience I can and will talk further about, I think this actually shows the spirit of constructive resilience. These are 5 joyful individuals who I believe are, what we see on their faces is an expression of the fact that they're confident that the service to their community that they were engaged in is aligned with their deepest beliefs in the oneness of humanity. They're confident that the cause of oneness will outlast the regime that is persecuting them, and that in fact one day that regime will be a footnote in history while that cause of oneness gradually embraces the entire planet. Now, this next slide, again, just to provide a few more faces to this. The man in this picture was another student of mine who was arrested in the middle of another semester I was teaching the course. What I think is especially touching about this picture, and he was the most gentle, thoughtful individual, but when he was the age, this is his family, and when he was the age of his son in this picture, his own father was arrested in the middle of the night and executed. So this is now a second generation experience in this family. There are many other stories I could tell just about my own students. I'll tell one more short story. I don't have a picture, but one year I was teaching the TA that had been assigned to help me inside Iran. Asked me midway through the quarter, she sent me this, again, very apologetic email saying, is there any possibility she could have a week off from the course? Because her husband, who had been in prison for 5 years, was about to be released. And she felt they needed a week to rebuild their marriage. So this is the experience of the people who have built and are participating in this university I'm describing, and the conditions in which they are doing so. And I think an illustration of everything I'm talking about. Okay. So, as a result of this posture of constructive resilience the Baha'is have displayed in Iran, Iranians from all backgrounds are increasingly recognizing the innocence of the Baha'is and their contributions to the wider Baha'i or wider Iranian society, and are increasingly speaking out on behalf of Baha'is, often at great personal risk. It's not an easy thing to defend the Baha'is in Iran. Similarly, outside of Iran, reporters, governments, human rights organizations from around the world are paying increasing attention to the injustices committed against the Baha'is in Iran and are also speaking out on their behalf. Just one notable example of this was an open letter written a few years ago by two Nobel Peace Prize recipients, Desmond Tutu and Jose Ramos Horta. This letter was addressed to the international academic community, and it appealed for academics around the world to speak out on behalf of the Baha'is in Iran who are denied education. Another maybe notable trend in terms of people arising to defend the Baha'is are a series of documentaries that have been made by independent filmmakers, themselves not Baha'is. Some of you may have seen some of these. One is a film called To Light a Candle by Maziar Bahá'í, a very famous international Canadian-Iranian journalist who actually had a movie made about himself that some of you might have seen. Rosewater, I think was the name of that movie. Another one of these documentaries is Education Under Fire, which looks very specifically at the BIHE that I was just referring to, by Jeffrey Kaufman and Amnesty International. Another, Iranian Taboo, by a well-known Iranian filmmaker Reza Alamezadeh, and I probably didn't pronounce that well. But another called A Quiet Genocide by Shapur Daneshmand. So, shining a spotlight on human rights abuses turns out to be a powerful means of deterring further abuses, because tyranny generally hates a spotlight. And in this age of global interconnectivity, it is really the first time in human history where it is possible to do this everywhere on the planet now. This is in part why Baha'is can pursue this strategy of constructive resilience so effectively. In the process, they're not only modeling a non-adversarial response to injustice, they're also contributing to the gradual maturation of the global human rights discourse itself, and to a rising consciousness of the oneness of humanity, which is the fundamental principle they're committed to. But in addition, on a purely pragmatic level, many observers outside Iran believe that a genocide against the Iranian Baha'is has actually been averted because of this strategy. Just one of the organizations that's written about this is called the Sentinel Project for Genocide Prevention. What they do is they study pre-genocidal indicators. In other words, what are the indicators that might warn us of a genocide. This organization arose after the experience in Rwanda. Never again, right? And then again. It happens, and so organizations have sprung up to really think, how do we actually see these coming further in advance? To marshal, international support to prevent these. Well, this Sentinel Project for Genocide Prevention has studied genocides throughout the past history, came up with a set of indicators that signal genocidal movements within the state. Many of these indicators are present in the case of the Baha'is of Iran. One of these indicators, interestingly, is denial of education itself, which was a precursor to both the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide. So it's not a unique situation the Baha'is have faced in that regard. So the Baha'is might already have been victims of a genocidal campaign if it had not been for the strategy they've adopted, which has denied the regime any pretext for an all-out assault, has fostered growing sympathy and moral support from non-Baha'i Iranians, and attracted the support of a growing chorus of outside observers to which the authorities in Iran are sensitive. This is why the Baha'is have been identified by another genocide scholar named Friedrich Affolter as one of the few documented cases of a minority that has managed to resist peacefully a sustained and systematic campaign of genocidal intent. So my own scholarship has sought to model this response to oppression along with the Baha'i community's approach to social change. In my work, I acknowledge that nonviolent opposition and civil disobedience represent significant advancements over violent strategies of social change, and clearly they have led to important short-term victories in the struggle for justice. But I also argue that nonviolent opposition is reaching a point of diminishing returns because it does not address the root causes of injustice and oppression. Injustice and oppression ultimately flow from a failure to recognize our organic interdependence and a failure to recognize that the interests of every individual and group are linked, and a failure to recognize or to translate this recognition into a more just and sustainable social order based on a commitment to our shared interests and our common human identity. Of course, there are many people who believe this is naive and unrealistic. But I argue that the truly naive and unrealistic position is to assume that humanity can continue on its present path of identity group conflict and interest group competition. We have, in effect, as a result of our own reproductive and technological success as a species, transformed the conditions of our own existence. Patterns of human existence, cultural patterns, social norms, institutional structures that evolved under different social conditions are no longer adaptive in the world we live in today. We might as well be living on a different planet from that in which those cultures evolved. And it's at this fundamental root level that we have to rebuild a social order on new assumptions about human nature and human identity. And this is not simply my personal views. This reflects, I think, the sort of deeply held conviction of the Baha'i community and what motivates us. So the question we have to ask is whether it's possible to translate this principle of oneness into a new social order. Some people say this is unrealistic. I would say we need a new realism. Ultimately, of course, there's only one way to find out: whether our species is capable of recognizing its common humanity and embracing its shared interests. We have to test the hypothesis. And the only way to test the hypothesis is to commit to it and see what fruit it yields. This is exactly what Baha'is are doing around the world and inside Iran, committing to the oneness of humanity in order to see what fruits it yields. In this regard, the Baha'i community can be understood quite accurately as a vast social experiment. Its approach to social change offers a valuable heuristic, or a framework for inquiry that opens up very significant lines of learning. Among the insights that are suggested by this heuristic, I want to touch briefly on 4, which sort of bring to the more, let's say, conceptual, theoretical contribution of this paper, which are elaborated also in this paper. So, the first of these, as long as underlying identities and interests remain in conflict, strategies of nonviolent oppression will be countered by increasingly sophisticated strategies of nonviolent oppression. I think one can read various sort of foreshadowings of this insight, going back to Antonio Gramsci, for instance, and his theory of cultural hegemony. But this is something I think we too easily lose sight of. And this is, I think, one of the, when I talk about, you know, the sort of, let's say, Gandhian strategies of nonviolent civil disobedience and so forth, this is where I think they reach this point of diminishing returns. Nonviolent struggles for justice, I think, are being outsmarted by nonviolent means of oppression. I think we can look at this in many countries in the world today, including the country I hail from most recently, the United States. So, so I mean, let me just give you an example that illustrates this more concretely then. You know, let's think about, for instance, the civil rights movement in the United States, which I think illustrates this point very well. This was led by Martin Luther King and others, most of whom began adopting Gandhian nonviolent strategies of civil disobedience, and won many very important victories, including dismantling a system of Jim Crow laws that had, you know, denied them the vote and access to public spaces on equal terms and so forth. As important as the victories of the civil rights movement were, they were, of course, followed immediately by new forms, more subtle forms of institutionalized racism and other oppressive social structures and norms, which ultimately reflect a failure to recognize the oneness of humanity and shared human interests. So because those strategies were unable to affect change at that level, racism has morphed into new forms, more subtle forms, and certainly we see those forms expressing themselves in many ways in the United States as we speak. The second insight my work suggests, as long as underlying identities and interests remain in conflict, even relatively successful strategies of nonviolent opposition tend to result in the transference of oppression onto others. What do I mean by that? Let me give you an example here. Think about, for instance, many labor movements in Western democracies, which have often adopted nonviolent strategies, sometimes of actual civil disobedience. And as important as many of the victories have been of those movements, they have actually often resulted in domestic and foreign trade policies that come at the expense of even less empowered workers within their own countries or in more impoverished countries around the world, transferring oppression onto others. The third insight my work suggests is that opposition to oppressive social systems ultimately diverts time and energy away from the construction of alternative systems. Hence the constructive aspect of the Baha'i approach, the emphasis on this. Now, the problem is that when oppressive systems are successfully thrown off by nonviolent opposition movements, a vacuum is left that creates a rush to power among competing interest groups, which merely invites new forms of oppression. We saw this half a century ago, following the independent struggle in India that Gandhi himself led. which resulted almost immediately in 500,000 deaths, in 12 million people being forced to migrate into the partition of India and Pakistan, which soon became nuclear-armed states living in a permanent stance of hostility towards one another. So that's an example of what I'm talking about. I think we've seen this more recently with the outcome of the so-called Arab Spring protests, which also were very directly and consciously rooted in Gandhian principles of nonviolent civil disobedience. And I think we've seen some of the outcome of that, the complexity of that process. It's one thing to throw off oppression. It's another thing to have something in place before you do so. So the fourth insight my work suggests is that oppositional modes of social change will ultimately not lead to lasting peace or justice because they reinforce the foundations of the prevailing culture of contest that is a major cause of violence and injustice. What do I mean by that? Well, my previous work, as Sully mentioned, has been focused on this culture of contest. What I'm referring to here is the fact that in Western liberal democracies, we have constructed virtually every social institution as a contest for power of one form or another, from our partisan political systems to our legal adversary systems to our capitalist economic systems, even to our grade-based educational systems, of which I participate in one as a university professor. In many ways, these were all remarkable historical accomplishments, but now, again, they've reached a point of diminishing returns. They're no longer adequate to address the complex, interdependent problems facing humanity today. And the way they play out between nation states is yet another domain in which the same problem reoccurs, preventing us from addressing fundamental existential crises like global warming. So, underlying this culture of contest are some very basic assumptions about human nature and social order. The most basic of which is the assumption that human beings are incorrigibly self-interested, competitive, aggressive, and that since that's our nature, the best we can hope for is to channel all that selfish energy into some, invisible hand, market-based system that presumably promotes the common good. And I'm not just talking about the economic system. This is the theory that underlies our political system as well. Right? So this view of human nature and this view of the social order that flows from it are the bedrocks of the culture of contest. The result of those flawed assumptions are a whole host of social injustices and ecological problems that I look at in my prior work, to which thoughtful people naturally respond in protest. But the problem with the culture of protest is that it actually reinforces the assumptions of the system that produce the outcomes that lead to the protest. So these oppositional models, in this sense, are self-defeating at a very profound, deep level, is what I argue. We need ways of dealing with injustice, of ecological devastation, that actually don't reinforce the underlying causes of those problems, which again is yet another reason Baha'is are committed to this model of constructive resilience, because it actually directly challenges those assumptions and offers in their place an alternative set of assumptions, which are, in essence, that human nature certainly is capable of self-interested motivations, but we're also capable of altruism. They were wired, in essence, for egoism or altruism, competition or cooperation, And which of those becomes expressed in human behavior is a function of our upbringing, our education, our socialization, the institutional structures we participate in, and the choices we make as beings with free will. So unless one learns how to systematically cultivate these other dimensions of human nature, one can never escape the cycle of injustice and oppression that characterizes the culture of contest. And that, I would argue, is the deep logic behind the approach of constructive resilience. So, maybe I'll just bring this to a close by suggesting that I think we can actually see this insights I'm talking about expressed not just in the Baha'i community, but actually in growing numbers of thoughtful people around the world, especially younger generations, who I think are desperately searching for alternative systems, who recognize that the systems they're living in are broken beyond repair, who are desperately searching for alternative ways to live their lives, to bring about social change, who often don't know exactly where to look or how to approach this, but are trying creative things. I think that we can see actually in many ways this sort of spirit permeating, the age we live in. And I think what the Baha'i model does is to bring into focus in a very illustrative case study the potential for new ways of doing things. So maybe, actually, there's one last thing I will close with then, and we can maybe have some comments and other thoughts. This model of constructive resilience, which in my work to date I've looked at specifically as a way of responding to oppression, it also actually has other expressions that we can see in the Baha'i community. It's a model that also Baha'is are learning to apply to overcoming natural disasters. So, for instance, in communities where Baha'is are well advanced, where our sort of systems and processes are fairly advanced, Baha'is have proven remarkably constructive and resilient in the face of natural disasters. One case that comes to mind is Vanuatu. Some of you might remember in the news a couple years back. It was hit with what was, I think, maybe the largest hurricane or typhoon ever recorded. Small island nation, literally wiped off the map in the sense of the structures and physical infrastructure on that island. And the Baha'i community was among the first and most effective to respond without outside aid, not waiting for help or handouts or assistance, but actually arising quickly to begin rebuilding and assisting others in need with the reconstruction of that island. This is an example of constructive resilience in another context entirely, but a context that I think will also become increasingly important as the world moves into conditions of climate instability and change, and the fierceness of the kinds of storms and natural disasters we're facing is increasing. Another context in which we can see the Baha'is pursuing the same strategy is in the context of being caught in the middle of civil wars. Another context which we see plenty of examples in the world around us, parts of Africa, parts of the Middle East today. Baha'i communities that are fairly well advanced in their processes and systems of building capacity and working together and working with others have proven actually quite resilient in countries like the Congo, which have experienced brutal, ongoing civil war and dislocation, and in which Baha'i communities are in many ways thriving and attracting large numbers of people to essentially a sort of, how do you continue to build the social fabric in such a context? We can also see, for instance, we can look at countries like Colombia, which is just emerging from 50 years of violent, drug-fueled, guerrilla warfare. And this is one of the communities in which, again, the work of the Baha'is is most advanced, and in which they've proven their resilience in yet another context. So I think actually we can see within this model not just the kind of response to like state-sponsored oppression in a country like Iran, but actually we see this as a model of essentially reconstructing societies in the context of disasters and violence and persecution of all manner. So maybe I can close on that note. I've spoken, I think, long enough. It's late in the day. Some of you may have some of your own thoughts or comments or questions. We could have some discussion.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank
It's
you.
absolutely fascinating to hear this, and the example specifically of the Baha'i Institute of Higher Education in Iran reminds me of we basically have in Jewish education, not only in Israel, around the world, and we tend to quote one of our founders who was very secular, David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister as well as the first Minister of Defense. He decided to take both jobs. And he said, it's good that we have enemies. It's good that people tend to want to destroy us, not just the state, but the religion, because it strengthens us. And the stronger the force against us, the stronger we unite and develop our identity. And he said, if there was no enemy, whether it be physical or whether it be religion, we would assimilate and disappear. And so I turn to your example, because obviously we have no way of knowing what would happen if it's an undecidable future. But the Baha'i Institute of Higher Education has definitely managed to strengthen education, at least for courses within Iran. If you could just speculate, what would or might happen if the youth, Baha'i youth in Iran, went to Iranian Shia universities? Would the same worry that reaches us reach you to that extent, that resilience without that force might mean assimilation or a changing even of religion, because you begin to adopt local patterns, local anthropologically, so it's a way of man. So is the stronger the outside force, the stronger you develop your own identity, unfortunately.
Well, of course, Baha'i youth in Iran were attending those universities up until the mid-'80s. So for quite a few generations, Baha'is were educating themselves in those universities. I understand the logic that you're referring to, and it's a real logic. Like, I think what Ben-Gurion talked about is certainly a very real dynamic, and it has probably served the state of Israel well in that regard. I think the challenge that logic runs up into, of course, is the changing conditions of the world we live in, and how long can that logic serve us? And are we reaching a point where actually that logic itself becomes too problematic? So while it's real and while it has achieved certain things, again, I would suggest maybe this is a logic that's reaching a point of diminishing returns. How far the changes that have occurred since Ben-Gurion said that on this planet, the contracting and the interdependence and the interconnectivity and the fragility, and now the existential risks and the stakes are such that I think in some ways every logic that has prevailed up until now needs to be carefully examined. This gets to a deeper question about identity, which I've also done some work in. So let me maybe frame it in that way as well. The dominant theory of identity formation in political science, psychology, sociology for a number of decades now, is that identities can only form in opposition. There can only be a we if there's a they, and us if there's a them. And this is such a deeply held view that it also actually permeates our popular culture. I can't think of how many science fiction movies we've all seen over the years where humanity's, at each other's throats, about to destroy ourselves, and the only thing that saves us is an alien, which gives us, an extraterrestrial them so that we can unite on this planet. Like, this is a deeply held proposition. And this is a proposition that Baha'is challenge. We actually believe it is possible to develop a primary human identity in the context of which many secondary identities can be accommodated, but ultimately to which those secondary identities need to be subordinated, and by which those secondary identities need to be evaluated, because some secondary identities are clearly incompatible with a primary shared human identity. So there are forms of racism, sexism, xenophobia, and bigotry that clearly can't be accommodated within that. But there are actually a wide scope of diverse secondary identities. So this is my understanding of how Baha'is would think about identity. But of course, this is not to say we've somehow accomplished this, and or that this is easy. This requires deep, profound thought to how we raise young people, how we educate young people, the institutions they participate in. But there's one other thought I'll add to this. The power of this identity, identifying with the oneness of humanity. There's a political psychologist named Kristen Monroe who, as a graduate student in the 80s, was studying rational choice theory, political science. And those of you who know rational choice theory will know that the big anomaly that rational choice theory has a hard time digesting is altruism. In fact, altruism is an anomaly that a lot of theories in the Western world have a hard time digesting, because so many theories today are based on this model of human nature as fundamentally self-interested. So many fields, psychology, economics, political science, sociology, have come up with ways of trying to explain altruism as self-interest in disguise. You've all heard some of these theories. They range. I mean, there's actually sociobiology and evolutionary theories have versions of this too. Well, Kristen Monroe became interested in this question of altruism, and can it really be explained away as self-interest in disguise? So she did a study in which she identified several dozen people who had done really heroically altruistic things that most of us would realize, okay, if ever there's altruism, that's a good example. The examples included, for instance, Germans during the Holocaust who sheltered Jews in their basements, even when those Jews were strangers, knowing that their own German families would probably be killed if they were discovered. So she said, that seems to qualify as what many people would recognize as altruism. Now, how do you explain it? Is that self-interest in disguise? This is what she wanted to ask. She looked at other people, someone who can't swim, who jumps into a raging river to save a child who's just fallen in, a stranger. So, what her study concluded was, in fact, there is one common denominator that every one of these cases demonstrated. That the common denominator that explained altruism. And what she found was that what these individuals all shared in common was a perception of the oneness of humanity. But it wasn't an intellectual construct that they were applying to a situation. it was an understanding that had become sort of woven into their consciousness in a way that expressed itself reflexively, without thought, as the sort of obvious thing that needed to be done. So she published a book called The Heart of Altruism, and the subtitle is Perceptions of Our Common Humanity. It actually won the Book of the Year award from the Political Science Association of the United States. It was a well-respected, award-winning, piece of scholarship looking at the empirical basis of altruism. Now, what that book suggests to me is, first, that this consciousness of a oneness of humanity is possible. Of course, one could say, well, maybe it's a genetic aberration, and a few odd people are born with this, and most people aren't, which is a possibility, I suppose. It needs to be further explored. My view, and I think the Baha'i view, is that no, these people learned this somehow, probably in different ways, from their families, from their communities, from some experiences they had in life, maybe with diverse others, who knows. But the pragmatic question it raises is if people are capable of learning this, how do we systematically ensure that more and more people learn this? It's a very pragmatic question. And this is in many ways the sort of fundamental pragmatic question the Baha'i world is focused on learning about. Like, here's a puzzle. We believe this puzzle is actually the key to human survival in the 21st century and beyond. And we need to get about solving this puzzle. How do you foster consciousness of the oneness of humanity in ever-widening circles of people? And I'm not just talking about inside the Baha'i community now. I'm talking about in our neighborhoods, in our communities, across society. So I think all of that is actually very much tied up to the question you pose. And it is a very valid question, and it reflects something we should be grappling with. Like, is identity inherently oppositional? Is it possible to transcend oppositional identities and submerge healthy secondary identities within a primary human identity? It's a very important question. Sorry, and that was a very long-winded answer. Sorry, please.
Yes, Dr. Lincoln, please.
As you were particularly this last bit, I was reminded if you'd been here, 2 weeks and 3 days ago.
The fires.
Thursday from 2 weeks ago. I happened to be here at the university by happenstance, and as I imagine many of you were, the fires started down in the city, and they evacuated the university, which means everybody had to get in their cars and get in their buses and go. And there are only two gates in, which can be turned into gates out. And so I'm sure with some of you, I spent an hour and 15 or 20 minutes in the parking lot in my car waiting to get out because it was simply impossible to get out. And
I walked home.
exactly.
Yeah.
Those who could did, but those who couldn't.
Yeah.
And what was interesting was it was a situation of uncertainty. You could see plumes of smoke coming up from the city, and no one really knew. So it was a very dramatic situation. And yet, what was interesting about it to me, which I was just reflecting on, if you were to stop at any highway intersection today and be less than expeditious once the light turned green, you would get honked at in no uncertain terms until there was no honking. There was, in fact, a completely calm atmosphere as everybody was stuck in the parking lot. So this is the highest proportion of Arab students and probably faculty in the country. There was at least one Baha'i in the group, and we were thousands of us stick in unable to get out. And so I was listening as you were sort of talking about the elements of constructive resilience and this notion of transcending identity. And I was asking myself the question, so for an hour, did we all go to a different place of identity? Because none of the usual patterns were in evidence. And I think my question to you is, do you see certain situations, responses to natural disasters in the world at large, as one example, forest fires, whatever it is, where these triggers are pushing groups of people, perhaps not all the way, but and perhaps not for very long. The jokes started very quickly thereafter, and then the usual responses and so on. But are there types of situations in the world at large where you see a path to what you call transcending oppositional identity accelerating?
Absolutely. I mean, no honking in Haifa is more of a biblical miracle, I think. But
In Israel, not only in Haifa.
but I think your point is well taken. That crises often bring people together in really profound ways. Now, crises can also do the opposite. So I think some of this depends on how prepared people are to come together. I mean, what sort of underlying foundations have been laid. But I think this is very common actually to see. In fact, there's been research done on people who've lived through, really profound disasters and crises, and many of them look back at those experiences as the most meaningful moments in their lives. For the reason you're talking about, for the effect it had on their relationships with others in those moments, and in emergence of those. And that they, often long to return to that long after the crises have passed. So I think there is something profound about that. And I think we are clearly moving into a world where crises are becoming more frequent and of a greater scale in certain ways. If nothing else, in terms of natural crises, natural disasters and these sorts of things. Hopefully we won't see the kinds of, military calamities that we saw in the 20th century, World War I and World War II, and but I don't know. I'm not. Who knows what the future is in those regards?
Yeah.
But yeah. I mean, mass migrations of people are increasingly common as a result of military conflicts as well as natural disasters. This is one form of these that I think, in some ways, we're seeing an increase of in the world today. So I would agree. I think your point is well taken.
Yes, please.
I just had a thought. It's interesting related to what you said. Maybe your point was slightly different, but if I'm not wrong, I think the highest institution in the Baha'i community, the Universal House of Justice with its seat at Haifa, also wrote about constructive resilience in 2009 and the years after 2010-11. I remember in one of these letters they define constructive resilience as avoiding extremes. One is just to be a victim and to be victimized. The other is that because of the suffering you tend to accept the traits and characteristics of the oppressor. And that is something interesting actually in your presentation, so I thank you very much for that, because I come from a religious studies perspective and an Islamic studies perspective, and it's interesting when, just to give two examples, early Christianity suffers for 300 centuries. In the 4th century, with Constantine, the change comes, and right away it takes 1 or 2 generations that actually persecution of minorities is undertaken through Christian power. And in Shia Islam, you have the Karbala tragedy Mujan was just talking about. If you have this minority highly suffering for centuries, and immediately in the 16th century, once the Safavids are established, doesn't take even a few years until this this real spirit of being victimized turns into an active oppression. So I don't have a good answer to it, but it seems somehow to be close to what you said, that people who are minorities, that are suffering, they are persecuted, that in a way the idea of constructive resilience implies also to be careful not to adopt, maybe unwillingly, the same system.
Yeah.
And then how to learn to deal with that might be an interesting question for the Baha'is, because at the moment we are still in this situation of being oppressed and a minority. But God knows, how things will develop in the future. So it's good that we have your research and other friends who are thinking about that also from an academic, scientific perspective. So I just thought it is close to what you said, and maybe in a way interesting to think about how in kind of overnight sometimes the whole thing can change. And once you're in a power situation, then you start to do similar things, which I don't think actually it will be in the Baha'i case, but just looking at history is a quite interesting example. So, well, thank you.
Yeah, I think I'm not a religious scholar, historian, but I think there probably could be some very interesting work done on the way this model, aspects of this that can be found in other religious communities throughout history in various moments of time, like the first 3 centuries of the Christian experience, which, from my sort of broad general understanding, I think reflects some of these same principles. And I'm sure one can find, moments in Jewish history and in other, religious histories where we can see, I think, a lot of this similar sort of dynamic at play. And in secular environments too, I'm sure. I think, again, I don't think Baha'is have a monopoly on these principles. We're trying to apply them very consciously and purposefully and systematically. But these are sort of, I think, human dynamics that manifest themselves in complex ways in many different contexts.
Well, I would like to say something here as well.
Yeah.
Assuming that we are sitting in the Baha'i War Center, not here,
Mm-hmm.
and we are saying to ourselves how we can actually implement those things.
Mm-hmm.
We have been trying for 170 plus years, and we have communities within countries, and it hasn't. Okay, we have now about 6 to 7 million Baha'is here and there, but for these ideas to come, whether for people to become Baha'is or to adopt them without being a Baha'i, throughout the, how many, 7 billion people around the world, something like that, doesn't seem practical according to the experience, humanity experience.
Mm-hmm.
It started from Cain and Abel, they just, one killed the other, because there was one too many, probably. And if we are in a hypothetical brainstorming thing there in the center, and we are thinking, so maybe apart from being communities without states, within states, maybe there should be parallel a Baha'i state, in which could be formed as an example to other states, that, this type of thing, everybody will look, not to compare, but many look at Israel, this tiny state that 69 years almost is, developed from deserted country. It became a superpower and this and that, and many countries around are actually looking with enmity, but still they're looking, oh, these guys, they did something. I say maybe this is an example of, I know it is against maybe the teachings of the, but what do you think? Just it came to my mind as we were talking, just to have another medium that will be I would say the optimal state, how it should be run, implementing all the ideas within one state. It's a question of where you will put this state, yes? But maybe that island that you mentioned would be
Well,
just as a brainstorming exercise. I'm just
I think it's a very good question. Baha'is, if we read the writing of Shoghi Effendi, the Guardian, he envisioned exactly what you're talking about. The question is how you get there.
Mm-hmm.
So, the vision that Shoghi Effendi laid out in its broadest terms is the gradual growth of Baha'i communities, that this process accelerates, that there are convulsive processes in the world, crises of global proportion, that actually, along with the sort of preparation and growth of the Baha'i community, precipitate mass conversions in some parts of the world. And when you have majorities of Baha'is living in a given state, you have not a Baha'i state,
yes.
but you have a majority of people practicing the kinds of processes we're talking about, right? Well, in that context, you have a Baha'i administrative order growing and which is able to demonstrate its efficacy and its powers of attraction. And I think what we see looking around us in the world are, systems of multi-party democracy that are actually demonstrating their inability to deal with contemporary complex problems. And it's not difficult to imagine in that context a growing contrast between how Baha'is are learning to conduct elections and organize affairs and make collective decisions, and the dysfunction that we're seeing in so many countries and parts of the world today, that it's not difficult to imagine a state, the population of a state actually saying, we want that. We don't want this anymore. But this is a very different process. And of course, this is this is Baha'i, this is like a hypothesis we're testing. And Baha'is assume, we don't control the future, but we're acting in certain ways we believe may lead in this path. Let me, to illustrate why I think this may be not so unrealistic, though. I just came from a conference in Sierra Leone, International Peace Research Association. This is a country that's been devastated by brutal civil conflict, followed by the Ebola crisis. I mean, this is a country that's been flattened in every conceivable way. This conference attracted people from all over the world. Because it was in Africa this year, many African scholars. So there was a lot of discussion about conflicts in Africa. Many of those discussions were about electoral violence, which is common, not only in Africa, in many parts of the world. In fact, I think we barely escaped electoral violence in the United States this year, and I'm not sure we have yet. It was very interesting listening to all these presentations on electoral violence. The whole conference wasn't on it. It was just a theme that kept coming up in context after context. Everyone was analyzing the particular cultural context that gave rise to electoral violence. What was unique about, country X that caused electoral violence? Nobody was stepping back and asking, why is it that multi-party democracy leads so frequently to electoral violence? This is a pattern that is so obvious that I think we need to begin to take its question seriously. That, again, this system, again, like multi-party democracy, is an incredible accomplishment historically. But I would argue that some of the things we're seeing in the world today, including in the country I'm living in, are the bitter fruits that come from the seeds, the deep assumptions embedded in these systems. So some people say what we're seeing in the world in situations like this is like the perversion or the corruption of multi-party democracy. I actually think it's a culmination and the perfection. But this is where it leads. This is when people ultimately figure out how to fully manipulate the system. This is what we get. And I don't think this is going away. I don't think there's a cure for that system. I think some countries are lucky and they have periods of stability that last a certain amount of time. But ultimately the systems are enforced through violence and they cascade into violence. And I'm not sure that's an escapable problem. So it could be humanity just has to live with that forever, however long we can, before we probably blow the planet up. Or it could be we have to actually embrace radically different ideas about democratic governance. And I'm not talking about authoritarianism and that sort of thing. I'm talking about fundamentally rethinking how we do just and responsible governance. So when this question about a state, I think is very important. I wouldn't be investing my time and energy in my life as a Baha'i if I didn't believe it was actually laying the foundations for the possibility of a new kind of state. Now, what's the time frame? I think you might remember last time I was here, we actually, this is what we were
It comes up.
having a conversation. What's the time frame? God only knows. I mean,
Well, just
how
hope.
bad do things have to get before